Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 16th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, by the media, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Today is April 18th. The 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive, remembers that famous day and year. A peculiarly political poem, by the way, about both the American Revolution and even more the Civil War. But I wanted to mention the fact that this year, the 18th of April, is the third day of Passover and Good Friday in the Western and Eastern churches. We note that both holidays are political holidays. The Exodus commemorates liberation from an empire, and Good Friday, the execution of a revolutionary by another empire. Both are often turned into spiritual events by both religionists and anti-religionists, but they are eminently political. In a passage in the Gospel according to John, in a confrontation between the military governor of Jerusalem and Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus is pictured as saying, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." And that's taken, as I say, by both religious and anti-religionists to say, oh, well, this is some sort of spiritual notion. In the New Testament documents, which is where that comes from, the term world doesn't mean the natural world, rocks, trees, things like this. It means the political world, the social world. And what is being denied there is that the kingdom of God that Jesus of Nazareth preached is just another kingdom like the kingdom of Rome or the kingdom of the various surrounding political entities. It is still eminently political, and if we step back and look at the Passover story in the book of Exodus, we find the same thing. As a bit of theater, the book of Exodus reaches its climax in chapter 20, the delivery of the Ten Commandments. And the striking fact is the Ten Commandments in their historical setting are a revolutionary manifesto dedicated to the overthrow of traditional authority and of religion. The Ten Commandments, written down perhaps as early as the 5th century BC, but they represent a view that goes back perhaps another half millennium to the beginning of the people of Israel, who were incidentally probably not originally what we would call an ethnic group at all, but closer to what we might call today a class. The Israelites as a people begin in a revolution of slaves against the Egyptian Empire, a massive rejection of the society, political and religious, of the time. The society was presided over by a king whose position was guaranteed by the gods in the popular understanding. The Hebrews, the word is originally apparently descended from a word that means outlaws or revolutionaries. The Hebrews rejected both the king and the gods. The Exodus events of perhaps the 13th century BC were not so much a migration as in the Bible story, but a going out, an exodus, from a society and its assumptions. The Ten Commandments are the proclamation of that revolution, a declaration of independence of liberated Israel. the text begins with a presentation of a liberator styled Yahweh, a strange form of the verb to be in Hebrew. Yahweh, who brought you out of the house of slavery, was the presentation. Yahweh is not a god in the sense of the surrounding society. God's guarantee authority, Yahweh destroys it. You shall have no gods is the first command laid upon the Israelites in chapter 20 of Exodus. And in, historically speaking, idolatry, the acceptance of gods, is the greatest sin in the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, because it means bowing down before symbols of oppression. The Christians, when they were persecuted in the Roman Empire, were not persecuted on the basis of new laws, but because Christians were atheists. In the eyes of the Roman law, they didn't accept the gods. The only image of, even an image of Yahweh is forbidden by the Ten Commandments at the start. The only image of Yahweh is humanity, as the beginning of the book of Genesis says. So the prohibition against misusing the name of Yahweh, which also stands at the top of the Ten Commandments, is about using Yahweh, the word, as a name in magical rites, the way in which the names of the gods of the surrounding peoples are used. In other words, the prohibition against misusing the name of God doesn't have to do with, don't say goddamn, it has to do with literally practicing religion. You are forbidden to practice religion. You are forbidden to treat Yahweh as a god. It continues in, if we put the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, in their historical context, the commandment about the Sabbath has nothing to do with going to church or any other religious activity. On that day you shall do no work, is what the text insists. It's a commandment against the idolatry of work. The revolutionary Israelites were slaves valued only for their work. Quote, "We are people, but you have forgotten it," close quote. The next commandment, by the way, is the same. Honor your parents, has nothing to do with obedience. It means don't discard people just because they've gotten too old to go to work. The people are not to be valued for their work alone. The rest of the Ten Commandments are a picture of the society that was being rejected, the society that claimed the power of life and death. You shall not kill is against the society's right to do that. The commandment against adultery is not even about sex primarily. The Hebrew Bible isn't very interested in sex. It's interested in life, but it's not interested in sex. The commandment against adultery is a commandment against invading other people's families. And it's like the next commandment, the commandment against stealing, which is not about property, but about people. You don't invade people's families and steal their wives, their children, and so forth and so on. This is the society that's being sketched, and the demands that are being made of Israel, what Israel thought the demands were being laid upon it, was not to be a society of that sort. Such a society is based on greed, you shall not covet, and requires the protection of lies, you shall not bear false witness. The Ten Commandments sketch the sort of society the Israelites thought themselves called upon by Yahweh to construct. Commandments are not primarily individual, but social, communal, a demand for a just community without the domination and stratification of most previous and most subsequent civilizations. Now, there's an aspect of Israelite religion that is particularly remarked on by our mentor Noam Chomsky in a recent interview. Prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, is not a matter of telling the future. It's not a matter of fortune telling. It's a matter, as has been said, of forthtelling. That is, of calling Israel back to this demand for a just society that exists at its foundation. Chomsky writes, "The word prophet is a very bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word, navi. Nobody knows what it means." That's not quite right, I think. But today they'd be called dissident intellectuals. They were giving geopolitical analysis, arguing that the acts of the rulers were going to destroy society. And they condemned the acts of evil kings. They called for justice and mercy to orphans and widows and so on. In other words, the Ten Commandments. Chomsky continues, I don't want to say it was all beautiful. Dissident intellectuals aren't all beautiful. You read Sakharov, who is sometimes appalling, or Solzhenitsyn, and the Nevi'im, the prophets, were treated the way dissident intellectuals always are. They weren't praised, they weren't honored, they were imprisoned like Jeremiah, they were driven into the desert, they were hated. Now at the time there were intellectuals, prophets who were well treated. They were the flatterers of the court. Centuries later they were called false prophets. People who criticized power in the Jewish community are regarded the way Ahab treated Elijah. You're a traitor, you've got to serve power, you can't argue that the policies that Israel is following are going to lead to its destruction, which I thought then, says Chomsky, and still do. I particularly admire Amos' comments that he's not an intellectual. I'm not a prophet, I'm not the son of a prophet, I'm a simple shepherd. So he translated prophet correctly. He's saying, I'm not an intellectual, he was a simple farmer and he wanted just to tell the truth. I admire that. And that sort of truth-telling, he says, that forth-telling is at the heart of the tradition of prophecy, which, by the way, is taken up in Islam. The principal title of the prophet of Islam comes directly from this Israelite notion of prophecy. Now, we'll put aside for a moment the question of the politicization of the Christian movement, except to suggest that it begins precisely as a political act. The execution by the military governor of a revolutionary, this is the way Jesus is understood by the Roman authorities, is the event that is commemorated on Good Friday. The statement of the crime for which Jesus is executed is, according to the gospel stories, placed on the cross. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. He made himself King of the Jews. And so the question of kingship is at stake, as it was in the Exodus. It's been pointed out that the judicial execution of Jesus of Nazareth is a political act that if it had occurred a few centuries perhaps later, instead of crosses on chains around their necks, some Christians might wear little electric chairs or perhaps little hypodermic needles for the present form of execution. Maybe a drone, going back to the cruciform, the way in which American presidents have been told they can execute people by the courts this week suggests that we're looking at a tradition here that needs to be remembered on Good Friday. So you are listening to News from Neptune, the Pesach edition, and we will have Ron Szoke drive in the first nail.
Thank you, Carl.
Don't forget to cross your legs first.
You saw the movie, yeah?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, I wanted to start by mentioning the passing of Gabriel Garcia Marquez,
Yes.
the great writer in Spanish who died in Mexico City at the age of 87. I never read that much of Garcia Marquez myself, mostly preferring Borges, but anyway, I think that deserves mention. I want to talk a bit about grand unified theories, and this is an aspiration in physical science, chemistry and physics. One grand theory that will explain everything that happens. And this is viewed as a foolish kind of goal by some people, and others think it's eminently reasonable, and they think that we may even be approaching it since the verification of the existence of the Higgs boson, which is supposed to explain all of the dark mass and maybe eventually the dark energy in the universe. But I want to talk instead about, is there a grand unified theory of social science? And closest thing we've had to one, I think, has been Marxism. But its faults and problems have been endlessly pointed out by American social scientists. My attitude is somewhat like this, that Marx was in some ways the Newton of social science. Newton's physics is no longer adequate in the physical sciences, but it's the best thing going in the initial approach to any socioeconomic phenomenon. So I suspect that the Marxism of 2014 is going to be a little bit different from the Marxism of 1844, but just as in physics, the physical theory of 1844 is no longer adequate today, but it's always, it seems to me, a remarkably good first approximation to everything that's going on. And that's my attitude toward it, somewhat ambivalent, but viewing it as always a good place to start. So this rambling note was provoked by something in a recent edition of Too Much, a publication that explores the ever-increasing American class divide between the rich and the poor. He proposes, the author of this, Sam Pizzigatti, this kind of grand unified theory, GUT. Pick a political phenomenon in the United States today. Somewhere in the shadows, if you dig deep enough, you'll find a billionaire feverishly pulling levers to avoid paying higher taxes. Or some Paul, just as fevered, working to remain in that billionaire's good graces. So he takes as an example the stunning fall into political irrelevance of David Camp, the longtime conservative Republican congressman from Michigan, who chairs the powerful House Ways and Means Committee. Camp undertook an extensive multi-year review of the tax code, trying to come up with something more rational, more streamlined, as they say, simplified, and so on. But when his fellow Republicans saw it, they immediately repudiated, and Camp resigned his seat in the House and sank out of sight immediately. It was amazing. What explains the behavior of these Republicans? Well, one possibility is sheer defiance and spite of everything that looks like a tax cut or a tax increase that looks like it's coming from the Democrats. But Pizzigatti's theory is that it's this aversion to any kind of tax increase that is at the bottom of the well always. He thinks that this explanation works equally well for the amazing, hysterical reaction of our conservatives to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, which many liberals, leftists, Democrats, socialists, and others have many grave objections to. It's obviously deeply flawed, but the reaction to it among the Republicans, wanting to make that the sole issue of the 2014 elections, off-year elections, and 2016, is really amazing. It seems to be out of bounds. He says, on its face, this unrelenting opposition to President Obama's Affordable Care Act makes little sense. The basic policy framework of the Obama health care reform, after all, comes from a conservative think tank. That framework first translated into actual law at the state level under a Republican governor. Some suggest a purely partisan explanation. Whatever President Obama pushes, Republicans must oppose. But the Obama White House has also pushed hard on a controversial education agenda that revolves around a widely unpopular at the grassroots high-stakes testing regimen. Why have conservatives in Congress done so little to make Obama pay for this unpopularity? Why have they so single-mindedly focused on Obamacare, and well, when they were not trying to focus it on Benghazi. But anyway, maybe it's because rich people don't like to pay taxes, and Obamacare does more to raise taxes on the rich than any legislation over the past 2 decades. The Obama Affordable Care Act puts in place a 0.9% payroll tax and a 3.8% tax on investment income for couples making more than $250,000 a year. So it will have no effect on those making less than that. The Affordable Care Act also sets a welcome corporate tax precedent. Under this legislation, health insurance corporations will no longer be able to deduct off their taxes any top executive pay they shell out that runs over $500,000 per executive. So Pizzigatti says, our grand unified theory of contemporary America's political universe may wind up not explaining every phenomenon that streaks across our political landscape, but we live in a plutocracy. The longer this plutocracy lingers, the grander an explanation of our grand theory will be. So this is going on at the same time. The economists are not objecting to this for the most part. There are a few, such as Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz, who are saying things like, what's wrong with China? According to Stiglitz, China now suffers from too much market and too little government. When China embarked on its original economic reforms more than 30 years ago, it was clear that the economy needed to become more market-oriented, said Nobel laureate economist Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University. And so it has, with the private sector far more important now than it was, he wrote in an article for Project Syndicate. Moreover, there's a broad consensus that the market needs to play what officials call a decisive role in many sectors where state-owned enterprises dominate. But Stiglitz's point seems to be that it's been overdone, and China is starting to see the results of unfettered capitalism that always begin to occur at some point. That seem to be inherent problems in a capitalist economy. And as I mentioned once before, every real-world economy is some kind of combination or hybrid of traditional market and command economies. They all exist somewhere within that triangle, but a pure or bare market economy is, it seems to be infeasible and almost unthinkable. But anyway, what are some inherent problems of a capitalist economy? Boom and bust cycles, bubbles and panics. One explanation of this is the Minsky syndrome, it's called, named after the post-Keynesian economist Marvin Minsky, who we've had occasion to talk about here before. After a prosperous period, our capitalists start acquiring ever more animal spirits about, if we're making this much money, why can't we make even more by taking on even riskier investments? And we see what happens eventually with that. So another consequence is ever more lopsided inequality, which becomes eventually a constraint on growth. Monopoly, another symptom. Mergers and acquisitions going on all the time when companies buy out and ruin their competitors. Unemployment, the reserve army of the unemployed. And finally, the immiseration of the middle class, which we've seen in some cases will turn not to socialism, but to fascism. And I think that's a daunting prospect. So I wanted to mention an interesting symptom of what's going on among our economists, our official and influential economists. Manchester University in England has a economic unit, which has canceled the module in their economics course that was proposed by the students in the university at Manchester. That's interesting, by the way. This goes all the way back to Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. Manchester University moves to scrap the banking crash module, and thus angering the students. Manchester University bosses came under fire from an angry economics students after they scrapped a groundbreaking course that examined the effects of the 2008 banking crash. In an escalation of the crisis-gripping university economics departments, the course leaders canceled the Bubbles, Panics, and Crashes module developed to answer protests at the dominance of orthodox free market teaching. Students said the U-turn undermined the credibility of senior staff who promised reforms and meant that the department was actually obstructing debate over the causes of the financial crash and why it occurred. So there's a official ruling orthodoxy that they were trying to challenge, but the higher people in the university said, no, we can't do that until you supply us with a sufficient incentive to include it, and that meant rebellion to the students. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ron. There's at least a symbolic note there that in your last story, that it's Manchester University where this debate breaks out. In the 19th century, the phrase Manchester liberalism referred to the assertion that government should not try to control capitalists, business, anything that they do, that trade should be free, that people with money should be allowed to do with it what they think best, and that will work out better for everyone. In other words, a century and a half ago, essentially the view of contemporary neoliberalism, which dominates both political parties in the U.S. So Manchester liberalism comes full circle here very nicely. It wasn't the university that was at stake then, of course. It was the manufacturers and capitalists based in Manchester that gave the attitude its name. You got to take David on Ron's gut here, so to speak.
You guys have both made such fascinating comments here that I feel, overwhelmed with all the things I would have liked to have responded to, and there isn't time.
Hey, you've got the floor.
But I am thinking one thing about Chomsky, as always, makes fascinating comments about unified theory and in his critiques of science, and he pretty much says there hasn't been a unified theory of the physical world since Newton's theory of gravity blew it out of the water in the 1700s. And
that's an important point.
Another thing that Chomsky likes to point out is that when we talk about theories of things, we're not really talking about things, and that having a theory of something is sort of the next best, is sort of the fallback way of understanding the world, as opposed to really understanding the world. And a theory by nature, and so, Chomsky understands this, and he's pro-scientist and pro-science and all that, but he understands that in order to have a theory about anything, you exclude all kinds of things. To explain anything, you have to exclude everything else. And one thing, Chomsky doesn't talk about Marx a whole lot, but one thing I recommend people do is maybe David Harvey, the great Marxist anthropologist, has some lectures online about Marxist Capital. Even if you just watch the first couple of those talking about Capital Book 1, you see that what Harvey's talking about is Marx trying to begin with a kind of unified theory of money, of the economy in general, but he begins he begins his theory by excluding everything else except commodities and money to explain these things in sort of a bare bones way. And I think that the way Harvey tries to explain that, and he does it over and over and over again, the way Marx kind of did things over and over again too, till he got to the point where he wanted to explain it the way he did. And so I think these things help us demystify. I mean, even though they're theories and even though they change, they help us demystify how we look at the world. I think Marx did a wonderful job of doing that. When we talk, I mean, I'm going to mention this in my own comments, but the notion of making money, we go around talking about making money. We got to make some money. What the heck does that mean? Why do we say that? Did people always say that? What is it we're trying to do? We're trying to feed ourselves, put a roof over our head, but we talk about it completely in terms of making money and where does this money come from? Who makes it? And I think that David Harvey is particularly good at explaining how Marx understood these things, and I think it's very helpful. And beyond that, the comments I would make about the very appropriate comments you make about wealth and taxes. The recent book, Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. How do you pronounce it? Piketty or Piketty?
I think it's Piketty. I think we're saying Piketty. How he pronounces it. Yeah. Hey, he's a Frenchman. God knows how he pronounces it.
Who cares? Yeah. But I mean, it's being called a kind of Marxism for the 21st century, and sort of a reworking of Marx. I have the book on my coffee table. I haven't opened it yet, although I've read lots about it. And I guess the one thing I would mention is that, and he was in this country, maybe he still is in this country, there was a symposium in Washington, D.C., in which two economists that we've referred to often on this show, Dean Baker and Mark Weisbrach, were responding to his work. And what Piketty is saying is that we're just not going to deal with this without a wealth tax, without serious.
Exactly.
The nature of capital's wealth tax. And even though I agree with Baker and draw a lot on him in lots of ways, their sort of practical issue, is that they think there's a lot of practical things that can be done other than anything is politically infeasible right now as a wealth tax, which you point out what happens to a Republican congressperson who dares expose the idea that we need to get some money from rich people. And I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of the state as we go round and round about the state budget and all this silly policy analysis about what we do with this tax or that tax. We've got a state budget deficit of a few $1 billion, 6, 7, 10, however you want to talk about it. We've got in this, if the data I understand is correct, we've got in this state, just in this state, if it reflects the proportion of this country, something like $500 billion of investable assets owned by people in this state. $500 billion. So you would need 1 or 2% of that money to balance the state budget. We've talked about this before. I know, Carl, you talked about it.
This is absolutely central.
Yeah. So, so there's just, we have to, I think it's an exciting time to be alive with all these ideas going around that the crash of 2008 have focused us on, and all the research that's followed from that, whether it's the Occupy movement or the writing about debt and money. We need to begin to see these things in a broader context and to understand, really, if we're serious in dealing with these problems, how we're going to do so.
Do we need a unified theory?
Well, there's no... Well, I think we don't really need a unified theory. We just need we need to go down a few layers in a kind of a thoughtful but tentative way, not thinking that we're going to understand the secrets to the universe, but that we can understand something about how the social world works. And I think that's what Chomsky, for all his dismissal of A, physical unified theory, and B, Marx, what Chomsky has done is given us a kind of unified theory. I mean, his manufacture of consent is a kind of unified theory of how the media works, and beyond that, I think there's things that can be, and his own science, his own cognitive science, has in the last 60 years evolved probably the thing that's closest to a unified theory in the physical world, the natural world of anything. Certainly, probably a lot closer. I'm not sure about this, but probably a lot closer. What even Higgs boson, however that's going to
boson,
is going to get us. But anyway,
the notion of theory of everything or grand unified theory. It seems to me, in some sense, that's a bit of a red herring. I mean, the task is to try to understand how things work so that you can do something about it.
Yeah.
And when we talk about Marxism, for example, for most of our lives, the word Marxism in American political discourse has meant the foreign policy of the Soviet Union or perhaps China, which, of course, anything Karl Marx wrote had very little to do with. The middle term, the missing middle term, socialism, rarely occurs in Marx's work. He didn't write about socialism. He wasn't particularly interested in socialism because he thought that was, in a sense, a problem for the future. Whenever he says anything in his works about socialism, he usually lapses into poetry and some very interesting passages in which he imagines what the future might think when it comes to deal with that problem. His problem was capitalism. He wanted to give an analysis of how the economy that he lived in, the society, not just the economy, the society that he lived in, worked. And that's what his major work was about, the political economy of the society of the modern world. Bourgeois society, he usually called it, from its dominant class. Now, what we have today and I think you're absolutely right, David, to suggest that Thomas Piketty, whatever his name is the legitimate heir of the questions Marx was asking, or his book is, and that needs to be attended to. Piketty himself has rather interesting stories of, to my mind, a rather young Frenchman who went off to Boston.
Right, MIT.
To MIT, where Chomsky was lodged for so many years, and sat with the economists there, and he said, you know, they've got a lot of funny economic models, and some of them are really quite cute, but they really don't have much to do with how the world works. So I'll try to do that. He's as much a historian as he is an economist. I'll go and try to figure out how the world has been working with capital, that is productive property, for the last generation or two, and see how it works over time. In other words, a continuation of Marx's project. Marx would have understood very well what Piketty is doing. But the explosive thing in both cases is that they end up with recommendations for what must be done in order that poverty and exploitation come to an end. And that's where, of course, our chief thinkers get upset with the Marxists and the Pikettys of the world. And it's very, very important indeed that they do that work, that Marx and Piketty write what they wrote then and now. The task is to change it, as Marx himself said. That's what needs to be done. And theory, in that sense, is a help, because if you don't have a good analysis of the situation, your changes will not have the desired effect.
Well, David seemed to be suggesting that we should go directly to the things themselves, the objects of knowledge, and
like capital.
we can go beyond theories. Is that what you're suggesting? That seems to be a little naive.
Well, no. I mean, I'm not quite sure how to unwrap that. But I think I've learned a lot. You know, to go back to the criticisms that Dean Baker had of Piketty, they're kind of operating different worlds. I mean, Dean Baker is a Keynesian economist and talking about practical things, about lowering the artificially high value of the currency to create jobs, and taxing, you know, if we can't tax wealth, at least tax financial transactions. And what Baker has argued, that we know things about how the world works from economic theory if people would just really listen, even what they might learn in this country in Econ 101 about money and deficits and demand. He's operating from a Keynesian point of view, and he's saying from that level we've been Keynesian for a long time, and we can keep being Keynesian in some ways that will actually help people right now instead of waiting for the millennium of a wealth tax. But it's also important to be honest with ourselves and say, if we really want to dig ourselves out of this, the only way is going to be a wealth tax. If you understand what Piketty is saying in this book, it's that the economy can't grow, that the value of capital grows faster than the value of labor. And that's a fundamental flaw, and it's going to destroy the whole system if we don't do something about it, namely a wealth tax to shift capital back to where it can actually do something.
Yeah. Well, some reviewers have tried to capsulize this in the symbols R greater than G. The return to capital has turned out to be much greater than the economic growth in the sense of the economy as a whole. So that means there's a more and more accumulation
Exactly.
in relatively fewer hands all the time. And that has to go bust eventually.
Yeah.
Or it has to be redistributed, as
Yes.
it was in the French Revolution and in the Great Depression of the mid-20th century. And a crash or a crunch like that becomes the only way in which the long-term tendency to immense concentration of wealth can be fought. That suggests both what we're looking at in years to come and the sorts of things that we need to do to deal with it. You're watching News from Neptune. David, you have the floor for issues you wanted to talk about today.
I wanted to here, hold up a book, which is called The Empire of Necessity, Slavery, Freedom, and Deception in the New World by Greg Grandin. I'm sure a lot of people who watch this show have heard about this book. They've seen Greg Grandin interviewed on Democracy Now! or on some other program. And even though I don't usually do book reports on News from Neptune per se, I just have finished reading this book and I'm so impressed by it that I wanted to at least blurb it myself a little bit and encourage people to read it. It looks like a big book. Really, the text is only about 3/4 of this book. The rest is pictures and notes and all kinds of other things. And it reads well, it's written well, it covers and it covers an area which we don't learn about in school in this country, even in the most general sense, the Latin American slave trade and how it evolved and what it came to and how it was resisted, including by the slaves themselves. The book, as you may know, is based on what Greg Grandin's inspiration was for this book was a novel by Herman Melville, Benito Sereno, and which was a novella based on this actual incident of a slave rebellion on a slave ship in 1805 off the coast of Chile, and American ships' encounter with that. And what Greg Grandin does masterfully and brilliantly, and I don't want to say geniusly, is to take this Melville's novel and this actual story and all the research behind the story of who these people were and how they got there and the society they lived in and the slave trade itself and the economy of the slave trade and Herman Melville himself and Herman Melville, who we just had a reference to Ahab before, and he talks about Moby Dick as well as Benito Sereno, in just a masterful narrative that Greg Grandin spins to really help us, if things could be gotten to at a deeper level through this kind of historical fiction in a way. I mean, it's history and it's fiction. It's some ingenious combination of history and fiction that will make you feel as if you understand something, maybe not at a grand theoretical level, but you sort of understand something at a little deeper and more contextualized and systemic level than I ever would have imagined. As much as I read about history and politics and everything, pretty much everything in this book was new to me. And so that kind of would just lead me again to reiterate the comments that I guess what I had originally wanted to say about this in the context of how we talk about slavery, how we talk about racism. If you read this book, the word racism probably isn't even used. And I think that's important to understand why that might be the case, what racism might have meant in the 17 or 1800s, what it came to mean after the Civil War, what it's come to mean even since the Civil Rights Movement, how we talk about that word and how it gets thrown around in relatively careless ways to help us understand or sometimes not understand how the world works. We have a week here where we've seen the murder of 3 people in Kansas by a racist, by a white supremacist anti-Semite. And the rhetoric that is bubbling out about all that in relationship to racism, anti-Semitism, white supremacy in the mainstream media, and even sometimes beyond the mainstream media, in the left media, isn't always all that helpful. I don't know if there's time to go into it in great depth
quite a very important point
in this program, but I'll leave it there and maybe we'll take it again, or you can respond to it and then we'll take it up again some other time.
I think you're absolutely right, David, and it definitely should be mentioned. I'm going to put a couple of things we've talked about today on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, including Chomsky on theory, a brief comment from Chomsky on theory that David was talking about earlier on. Review of Piketty that I think is clearest and most significant so far in terms of setting out the questions, which we will continue to talk about here, obviously here, because they're going to be talked about many other places as well. And finally, a review of the book that David's talking about by H. Bruce Franklin, one of the most interesting historians around for some time, writing on important issues having to do with war and empire in the U.S.
And a literary scholar himself.
Absolutely. And he wrote a review in the new and interesting L.A. Review of Books, which is trying, I think, to take the place of the moribund New York Review of Books, and maybe even challenge the London Review of Books, which is, in fact, a very good journal. But LA Review has a book by Franklin, H. Bruce Franklin, a review of Greg Grandin's book that I can recommend highly, and as I say, I'll try to make it available. There is a wonderful line. This is, in fact, Melville's line that Grandin quotes and Franklin picks up. Quote, "You are the moderate man, the invaluable understrapper of the wicked man. You, the moderate man, may be used for wrong, but are useless for right." Now, that's Melville, the reason that Grandin was attracted to him, and that Franklin writes about the important book that Grandin's written here.
One thing that Grandin does is contrast the Ahab in Moby Dick to the real person in Empire of Necessity, a guy named Amasa Delano, who was a forebearer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and look at how Melville look at the roles that these play in capitalism. And capitalism and racism and slavery in a very different way.
So there are some theory suggested here, perhaps, Ron, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think it's always been the aspiration of every serious thinker to arrive at some unified point of view toward things and to resolve the ambiguities, the tensions that arise in his own thinking. And this is always going on in the philosophy of science, it seems to me. There are the inner tensions in any theory where it's not completely compatible in all respects if you try to think systematically about anything. And then there's the outer pressure of trying to take in more and more facts and absorb them into the theory as well. And these push against each other.
But there's probably more damage done sometimes by arriving at a theory that, what's that wonderful line about a theory that's simple, straightforward, obvious, and wrong? Yeah. And I think of Chomsky's discussion of the mind-body problem here. He says, look, these various solutions of the mind-body problem, how the brain is related to the intellect and so forth, they're useless, he says, simply because the problem can't be formed. Not because we have no knowledge of what a mind is, obviously we do, but because we have no serious way of talking about what a body is. That the ancient science, the science that Newton destroyed, thought they did have. Descartes' science thought they could talk about a body, but Newton's horrifying doctrine of action at a distance, that is the universal law of gravitation, destroyed that notion. And so Chomsky says, look, there's no reason to think about a mind-body problem. We simply look at the phenomena and try to figure out what's going on. And we leave open the possibility, at least, that we can't do it, no more than a mouse could contemplate nuclear physics, But still in all, the task is to try to give a good account of what's going on in order to solve very real problems that we have. And with
with just one more thing, in referring to what you said, we're talking before about, Ron, about the market and neoliberalism, implying neoliberalism, and this dogma that governs this country, which doesn't purport to be, purports to be a unified theory, but isn't really serious, but it's politically powerful because it denies it. It dictates that we can't talk about a wealth tax. We have to talk about markets, and we have to talk about job creators and all of this nonsense. So I think that as we, in a serious and sincere way, look at the data and the theory and all the stuff, we have to realize that what we're up against here is people who don't care. People who are just they're wealthy, they're rich, they want to get richer, and they'll grab onto any idea that justifies that, and that. To some, that's the definition of ideology. I'm not sure if it has to be the definition of ideology, but that's come to be the misrepresentation of the world to the gain, to promote gain, to promote greed and self-servingness.
Yeah, well, ideology can be viewed. Mannheim says something a little different about this, but
yeah,
anyway.
He does.
But it's ideology is a theory of the proper and fitting distribution of wealth in society generally, and tries to provide a justification for either the present state of things or some more ideal state of things in the future.
In its most vulgar terms, it's the idea that the country ought to be run by the people who own it.
Yes,
John Jay, I think, the first Supreme Court Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
There's a line from Chomsky here that comes to mind. I quote, "The beauty of the democratic systems of thought control," speaking of grand unified theories and whatnot, "as contrasted with their clumsy totalitarian counterparts, is that they operate by subtly establishing on a voluntary basis, aided by the force of nationalism and media control by substantial interests, presuppositions that set the limits of debate, rather than by imposing beliefs with a bludgeon. Then let the debate rage. The more lively and vigorous it is, the better the propaganda system is served, since the presuppositions, U.S. benevolence, lack of rational imperial goals, defensive posture, etc., are more firmly established." Now, that happens both politically and economically, so to speak. That's what we're caught within. And in the immortal words of Thomas Pynchon, if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about answers. So let's ask a question, David, in a couple of minutes we have left about the shootings and these terrible murders and anti-Semitism. You alluded to the notion that this is misleading us into asking the wrong questions, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, there's just so much swirling around about all this. We have a little brouhaha locally about a 9/11 Truth conference. We have the real threat of fascism in the Ukraine, but at the same time, apparently some anti-Semitism, maybe kind of black hand kind of stuff going on in eastern Ukraine now. It's just and then the notion that whenever the Southern Poverty Law Center gets involved, and as they always come to the fore, and the SPLC was one of Alexander Coburn's bet noirs, along with the Anti-Defamation League, because Coburn well understood that racism and anti-Semitism were being exploited by these groups without getting to the bottom of what the phenomenon were. And what it really comes down to is how much of a threat is fascism per se, how much of a threat is racism and white supremacism and anti-Semitism per se. What are these? If these things are symptomatic of things, what are they symptomatic of? And how do we talk about these things without, jumping into the barrel and forgetting what's all around us? Two people that I admire a lot, Max Blumenthal and Chris Hedges, have both written books about the Christian right. and alarmist books about the Christian right. I haven't read either of these books, but my tendency is not. Well, first of all, my tendency is not to identify the Christian right with certainly with the kind of white supremacism that is evidenced by this Glenn Miller who did these murders. So there's just a lot that we need to step back from and look at, again, in this larger material class context, populism, left-wing populism, right-wing populism, mental illness, violence, guns, the whole thing.
Did you catch Abraham Foxman's comment?
I missed Abe.
Sorry.
I missed Abe. Isn't he retired yet? I know he's going to retire. I guess he's putting it off until this business is over.
Was it Coburn who said he was eventually going to be engulfed by his chins?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I know Norman Finkelstein has always made great fun of his chins, and that's probably not fair.
That's not fair at all.
We all have our looks, but still.
But what he had to say this week about the situation in Ukraine, I must admit, surprised even me. He said, look, we shouldn't be too worried about anti-Semitism showing up in the Ukrainian revolution, I think he called it. He's referring to the CIA-backed overthrow of the elected president of Ukraine. He said, we shouldn't be worried about anti-Semitism cropping up here because, after all, there's less anti-Semitism in Western Ukraine than there was in the Occupy movement.
I think I actually might have read that, come to think of it. Yes, and again, what's going on, the Ukraine just adds another strange twist to this whole idea, because anti-Semitism has continued to be a problem in that part of the world all these years, and the establishment in this country, the Zionist establishment in this country that is so focused on that, has always ignored that.
Yeah.
So, and there's a whole story behind that, which there's no time for.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 16th week of 2014. This and other versions of this program will be posted to our Facebook page, thanks to the efforts of our director and producer, Caleb, who gets to these things remarkably quickly. So I will suggest the Facebook page for some of this information and repeats of this program. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Szoke. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and do see our Facebook page. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.